This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 454, Drupal API Client. On today's show, we are talking about Drupal's API Client, what it does, and why you might need it with our guest, Brian Perry. We'll also cover Iconify Icons as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Brian Perry. Brian is a senior front-end developer at Chapter 3 who lives in the Chicago suburbs. Recently, he's been focusing on all things Drupal and JavaScript, including decoupled Drupal and the Drupal API client. He's also regarded as one of the foremost Nintendo experts in the Drupal community. Brian, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, happy to be here, and thanks for reading, my fake Nintendo criteria. I appreciate that.
Well, I'll give you a note about that in a few minutes, but I'm glad to have an updated bio for you. So I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are Randy Fay, lead maintainer at DDev. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
And joining us as usual, John Picozzi, solutions architect at EPAM.
Howdy.
Okay, so we have a couple of announcements this week. So just yesterday, we released the new and improved Talking Drupal site. So I'd like to thank Martin for helping out with some styles this morning. And Brian, your bio will be going on that site later this week, including Nintendo.
Could be our first takedown notice.
Nintendo would be the one to do it. But if you're, take a look at it. If you notice anything, have any ideas, feel free to reach out on the Talk Drupal Slack. We also have an issue queue on GitLab that you can post issues to as well. I'd also like to mention that Selwyn Pullet, who was on the show a couple of years ago, who maintains the Drupal at Your Fingertips guide, has released a new version of that guide, an updated version. So if you want to take a look at it, see what's new, he'd appreciate that. And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to empower your content creators to place icons from a massive open source library into your Drupal site? There's a module for that. It's called Iconify Icons, and it was created in May 22nd of this year, so less than 2 weeks ago, by David Galliano, GX Liano of Factorial. It has a 1.0.0 version available, which supports Drupal 9.3 or newer, right up to Drupal 11. It is actively maintained, has security coverage, test coverage, and a documentation guide, and it has only 2 issues open, neither of which are bugs. It's officially in use by one site according to Drupal.org, but I'm sure we'll see that increase quickly. Now, out of the box, the module provides both a CK editor button for replacing icons and a new field type. It even provides a new form element that can be used for custom forms, a render element that you can use to programmatically put an icon into something like a custom block, and a twig extension that can be used to place icons in templates. According to the project page, the Iconify icon library includes more than 200,000 icons, though in my limited experimentation, it seems like there are some duplicates between icon sets. Speaking of which, Iconify provides over 150 different icon sets, and in the module's configuration, you can specify which ones you want to be available on your site. Placing an icon is as simple as using an autocomplete to search the names of the icons available, and a preview is shown for each of the matches found. The field widget and the CK editor button both give content creators options for what size and color to use for the icons. For myself, I'd prefer to lock some of those options down. For example, make the part of the fields display configuration instead, but I'm sure that could be added as part of a different widget. I can think of a few Drupal sites I've built where this would have been really handy, so I'm interested to play around with this module some more and see how it evolves. But let's talk about Iconify Icons.
Yeah, Randy, I'm interested to hear your opinion because I saw a lot of activity yesterday as you were testing this out.
Well, I'm a pretty novice user. I'm pretty much a noob, and I couldn't get it to work. I couldn't get the toolbar icon to display on things, and I have to assume that I just don't know what I'm doing.
I bet, is it a button that you have to enable, Martin, on the text format? I bet you that's what you need to do.
So it did. The process was really to drag the button into the toolbar. It sounds like you were doing that, Randy. One thing I did notice is that when I used it in the like basic HTML text format, there must be some kind of a data attribute that it relies on. I could see the icon in the preview, but then when I saved it, it showed as sort of not available. So full HTML, it worked fine. So that tells me that there's probably some extra piece on the image tag that you need to enable for it to work.
And I was just editing Umami content, and it was basic HTML, so that could easily. I did try changing it to full HTML without success. But you know, when you're a novice, you never know what's going to happen to those things.
Yeah, I actually, not related to this module, but I was installing, I think it was actually the OpenAI module into CK Editor a couple of weeks ago. And I noticed that it actually had, not only did you have to drag the button to the toolbar, but down below it then had a settings section that you then had to click activate in order to actually have it working in your CK Editor. So I think that there's probably a couple of different ways you can configure these sorts of things. Although coming back to icons are a big hit with a lot of content creators. So do you have the ability with this mod? Is this only available in like a CK Editor WYSIWYG, or do you have an ability to kind of use it in just like a standalone field? Like if you wanted to provide an icon for like, I don't know, a file upload or something like that.
So it definitely does provide a new field type as well, so that you can do exactly what you're saying. You could say, you know, every article that I post, I want to choose an icon, or, you know, those kinds of things as well.
And now our listeners are like, well, clearly John wasn't listening, because Martin said the field widget and CK Editor button both give content creators the option for the size and color to use for the icon.
I'm glad you pointed that out.
I did. Yeah, I did. Because literally, as I asked the question, I was like, "Oh, the answer's right there in the page that Martin was reading."
And nobody listens to Martin, so it's just the way it is.
Oh, that's not true. I listen to Martin.
I mean, this definitely sounds useful. I love icon libraries like this. One thing that I always check, and I wonder how this module handles it, is for a icon library this large, like how does it handle what if you're just using a subset of the icons or just a specific icon? So you would be curious to see how this module handles it.
So the module has a settings page where you can basically, of all of the, I think it's 150 different sets, icon sets, you can pick which ones you want to have available on your site. So if you want to have everybody use just one set so that they all kind of look the same, you can do that in the settings, and that applies to both the CK Editor, you know, WYSIWYG, you know, icon placer, as well as those fields. So it sort of, you know, shares across all of that.
Cool.
And
yeah, that sounds like
it
that would help.
also is using external URLs for the graphics, so they aren't being downloaded and clogging everything up.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because the WYSIWYG, when you place those, it's actually pulling those from the Iconify API. But when you place them in a field, it actually embeds the SVG markup directly into the page. So it's actually different depending on how you're using it.
But that's nice, because that means that you can style them and they'll get cached better. So like you don't have to worry about, like, one of the things with these types of things whenever they're external is if you have a particular secure website, you have like CSV headers set up, that can always be a bit painful, especially if something changes upstream, things will break. But if it's just embedding the SVGs directly, there's no cross domain, there's nothing that's changed. It's all just HTML at that point. That's pretty nice. That's a nice feature. I'll have to check it out.
Sorry, I'm lost in the icon library now, just looking at all the different types of icons. The search on this page is very nice. You can type in things and it'll show you all the icons they have for that term.
There are so many different sub libraries that you have, when you first look at it, well, if I looked at it for the rest of my life, I would still wonder why I would want which one or how I would get the one that I needed. It's like a lot.
We've come a long way from Font Awesome being the only way to get icons on your site. I think there's a lot of great libraries, and it looks like Iconify kind of merges a few of them.
Have no fear. There are Drupal icons, and subsequently I was seeing how expansive or inappropriate the icons were, and there's also a middle finger icon if anybody's looking for that. So
there are also Star Wars logos in there as well, so
oh really,
you can geek out on that. Yeah,
now the real question is Nintendo on there, which it is.
Oh, they got Lego bricks, Nick. I don't see Star Wars. Is Star Wars 2 words? No.
No, it's search for Empire.
It's interesting to see which companies they're more afraid of than others, because it's under Empire, but Lego shows up and Nintendo shows up. So it's only a matter of time until that becomes game system and brick system. But anyway, this module I think was suggested by one of our listeners. So Martin, if folks want to get connected or suggest other modules of the week, what's the best way for them to do that?
We're always happy to get nominations for module of the week in the Talking Drupal channel in Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly through all the Drupal and social channels as Mandclue.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
All right, now on to our primary topic. So, Brian, let's start with what's new with you since we last spoke. I heard you have a new gig that's letting you work a little bit more on today's topic.
Yeah, I have recently changed jobs and started working at Chapter 3. And yeah, it's kind of just allowed me to stay focused on some of the decoupled Drupal stuff that I've been working on. And I was, focused on that at Pantheon, but was kind of being shifted over to work elsewhere within Pantheon and on the dashboard, which would have been interesting, but it just felt like the wrong time to kind of step away from some of the Drupal open source projects I've been doing. So at Chapter 3, I'm working on client projects, and also they help maintain Next for Drupal. So it just kind of brings a lot of these things together in an interesting way.
So you're working on more open source projects than just this one. Can you give us a quick overview?
Yeah, an overview of the Drupal API Client project specifically.
No. Well, besides that, I mean, other projects that you are maintaining, or
Sure, yeah, and I would say probably too many of them at this point. That's part of my problem, but. So there's the Drupal API client, which we'll be talking about today. At Chapter 3, Chapter 3 helps maintain the Next for Drupal project, which is a starter kit and a set of Drupal modules for using Next.js and Drupal for decoupled site builds. And then, there's a lot of other kind of one-off modules that I've been involved in. One that I've been working on a little bit more recently is the same page preview module, which I think is also something that was a past Talking Drupal show topic as well. But yeah, just in general, a lot of try to focus on decoupled work, but also interesting front-end ideas. I find myself, sucked into trying new things.
And for those listeners who are interested, we're actually going to have a show on the Next.js Drupal module in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that one. Okay. So we're talking about the Drupal API client, and typically we ask, can you give us the elevator pitch? But I'm gonna level up that question to, can you give us the elevator pitch, but also explain it to me like I'm a fifth grader, because I just don't get it.
Yeah, it'll be, somewhere in between. I don't want to be too patronizing, but basically the Drupal API client is a set of JavaScript packages that make it easier to interact with Drupal's APIs, usually on like headless or decoupled sites. So you can think of, it takes care of boilerplate and, common use cases. So one is just fetching data from Drupal's APIs. It handles a lot of the code that you would do to fetch the data in JavaScript. You don't have to write it yourself. Another simple one is authentication. There's a decent amount that you have to do to authenticate with Drupal's APIs. These packages can help you do that in a consistent way without having to write custom code. Does that help?
It does. When I first looked at it, it said Drupal API Client. I thought, oh, a CLI, so that I can access the Drupal API Client. And actually, I think that's missing, and it would be a great thing. But I understood after looking at it that the real thing is this is making it easy for stuff that's already JavaScript to access the Drupal API.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And I think that this has, already been something that has come up. And I think that the, Drupal experienced people, maybe put on their Drupal hats and start thinking of it from the perspective of, I'm in my Drupal site. How would I use this? And it definitely is, it can be used inside of a Drupal site, but it is a lot more focused on, in a JavaScript project external to Drupal, getting data out of your Drupal CMS.
Very cool. So this came out of or got funded by Pittsburgh at DrupalCon Pittsburgh a year ago, right? What was that? What was the status of this before that? How did that affect you? And say a little bit before you start about what Pittsburgh was in the first place.
Yeah, so Pittsburgh was at DrupalCon Pittsburgh, and they had a competition where people could submit project ideas and request an amount of funding. So a number of different organizations and the Drupal Association collected funds, and then the projects were voted on by the community to determine which was selected and all that good stuff. So we were lucky enough to be selected during Pittsburgh. As far as like the idea for the project, it's definitely something that has been kicking around for a while. And I have also maintained in the past a similar kind of library that makes it easier to source data from Drupal. There were other packages that do similar things. And it just seemed to be a problem that people were solving over and over. And Drupal, I think, ideally should have like an official opinion or official package related to. So Pittsburgh seemed like a great opportunity, even more so than the funding, for just a great opportunity for a lot of community visibility. And I think that that has worked out really well for this project. Being involved in Pittsburgh helped a lot of more people know about it and helped us get contributors and things like that.
How much funding did you get, and what did you use it for?
Yeah, we got $10,000. And yeah, the funding, there's definitely a lot of lessons learned with the funding. So what have we used it for? We did pay some of our contributors. There were also cases where we offered contributors to be paid, and they declined, and encouraged that we use the money in other ways. But aside from paying contributors, we also started an open collective, which was something I hadn't done before. And that was also an interesting experience in some ways. And so we also now have money in the open collective that we're hoping to be able to fund additional work beyond our 1.0, which we released as part of our Pittsburgh commitment. And that should also be able to pay for things like hosting, if we want to have example sites, public APIs that people can use, things like that.
I feel like it's one of the dichotomies of open source, right? One of the nice things is you can have competition, right? If you don't like or think a particular problem could be solved differently, you have the ability to make your own module. But you also want collaboration as much as possible, right? like you said, you're trying to solve the problem in a more standard manner. Web form, I think, is the golden, and ECA, like they're the golden examples for like a really strong framework that allows an ecosystem to grow up around them. Where if there were 25 modules that built forms, like in other CMSs, it's harder for that ecosystem to grow around. But I think once Pittsburgh finished, it was a little difficult to kind of follow what was happening. So I'm curious a little bit if you can elaborate a little bit more on what that process was like before we turn back to the topic at hand. Like, how long did it take before funding was released? Who did you communicate with? And maybe we should have a show more explicitly on Pittsburgh at some point. But, as somebody on the other side of it, I'd be curious to know what that experience was like.
Yeah, and I definitely think there's a lot that could learn there. And I think that part of it is that each of the projects had kind of different goals and different things they committed to in their scope of work. And for us, what we committed to was a 1.0 release of the JSON API client, and some other things. But that's a real easy to understand thing. We're going to ship a release. You can go download it. And then some of the other projects didn't really have as the same sort of shippable milestone, which I think makes it a little bit harder to kind of follow what's going on. But as far as the process, Alex Moreno was the person who essentially led coordinating all of the Pittsburgh projects. So we kind of worked through him and had regular check-ins with him. And then initially for the funding to be released, we had to create a statement of work that the Drupal Association agreed with. And the way that we structured it anyway was that it was half paid upfront and half upon completion. And yeah, right around the time of DrupalCon, we were one of the later projects to finish our commitment. But we made our final payment was made recently.
So,
and one last thing before we move on, what's the name of the Open Collective? And we can put that in the show notes too.
Yeah, it's just the Drupal API Client.
Awesome.
And we have a Pittsburgh specific project underneath it.
Great.
So coming back to the Drupal API client, you did a great job explaining it in your elevator pitch response. So I now understand that the question I'm about to ask is kind of not accurate, but I'm gonna reword it because I have a kind of a follow-up question to it. So like the original question was like, is this almost considered like a normalizer for JSON API, which is not true, right? It's a JavaScript package that's kind of like a utility to be able to interact with JSON API, right?
Yeah, and technically that is a feature that is part of the JSON API client. You can essentially like deserialize the response you get back from JSON API. So that's close to that, but it's not the only thing that the package does.
And then like, I guess another question here, or the second part of this question for me is like, instead of building this as a JavaScript package, right? Why not? Was it not possible to just build it into JSON API so that JSON API had this functionality like itself?
Yeah, I mean, so that is, based on the assumption that like a deserialized or flatter version of the JSON API response is preferred, which is my personal opinion, but not necessarily everyone's opinion. So I think from the perspective of trying to create something that is a little bit more of a standard Drupal building block, I think the fact that this package can handle it either way is a good thing. But that also kind of gets back to the, why did Drupal select or put all their cards into JSON API overall and not something like GraphQL? It really comes down to preferences with like a query language or an API format. So that I think is potentially even like a little bit beyond the scope of this project. We're just trying to make it as easy to talk to Drupal's APIs. But the other thing that we tried to stress in the project is that even though the thing that we're delivering initially is this JSON API client 1.0. We were really trying to make it extensible. So there actually is like a base class that is just the API client class that the JSON API package extends. And we tried to put all of the things that are just really not specific to JSON API or a specific query language in that base class. So things like authentication and caching all lives there, so that this could eventually be extended to have a GraphQL package. And we also, as part of development, created a package that just talks to the decoupled router endpoints, which technically doesn't follow the JSON API spec. So there's a piece to this, which is a set of packages that can talk to Drupal's APIs beyond JSON API.
So I read in your project page that like you really stress that it's agnostic about various JavaScript frameworks, and you make that really, really clear. So why was that so important?
Yeah, probably the main reason for that is that in the time that it took you to ask that question, a new JavaScript framework was released. But yeah, the JavaScript ecosystem.
Or 3.
Yeah, just moves really fast.
Even JavaScript framework fans admit that.
Yes. But yeah, especially the JavaScript ecosystem moves fast, and not to hurt anyone's feelings, but I'm part of the problem. But the Drupal JavaScript ecosystem probably does not move as fast as the JavaScript ecosystem. So, even from the perspective of like Next.js and React, which is definitely kind of the like leading framework, if I think going all in on one of those frameworks, you'll be caught in the future when something else becomes more popular. So the more that you build into a framework like this around Next.js or Vue or something specific, it's harder to respond when things change. So that's why I think it's really important that a package like this is just something that can work with vanilla JavaScript or any of your frameworks, and I'm hoping that it can be repurposed in a bunch of different ways. And another example kind of in that neighborhood, like even just thinking about Next.js, within that framework, they've also had a lot of kind of major changes and churn recently, in that there was basically a way that you built sites using their pages router and a way that you built sites using the app router. And even those things change. So if a library like this was just built around the pages router, it would have to go scramble when Next.js releases the app router.
Okay. Brian Perry, you're clearly a JavaScript genius, and I'm clearly an idiot. Can you?
That's not true. Neither of those things are true.
So can you just explain to me really quick, like, where does this Drupal API client sit, right? So like, I imagine like it sits between like your JavaScript thing, right? React, Vue, whatever, right? And the Drupal backend, right, of your site, wherever the Drupal API is coming from, right? So is it like it's a package built into your app that helps you connect to that backend? Is it so it's not necessarily like within Next.js? It's literally within your app, right?
Yeah, and that is definitely one of the things that makes this a little hard to talk about, because there are a lot of different use cases, especially because we're trying to make it framework agnostic. But it lives in your JavaScript. It is it's delivered a couple of different ways as a node package, or you can also just use it off of a CDN if you're not using a bundler or Node.js. And it lives wherever your JavaScript lives. So if you were to use it in Next.js, for example, you would npm install the package, and then create an instance of the JSON API client class and use it. If you wanted to use it in Drupal for like a progressively decoupled project, you would load it as a library. You could have a node package or a package.json in your theme or something that bundles it together. Or you could just load the script as a library from an external CDN. And then it would just be the same thing. You would use it in your JavaScript, create an instance of the class, and call it.
Okay. And a lot of frameworks now that are once were JavaScript are actually now technically TypeScript. Does this work with TypeScript? Is it written in TypeScript? How does it interact with TypeScript?
Yep. Yeah, it's written in TypeScript. So those who may not be familiar with TypeScript is like a superset of JavaScript that is strongly typed. And JavaScript is not at all, much in the way that PHP historically has not been, but recently there's a way to have strictly typed PHP code.
So you're hitting the keyboard hard when you're coding it? Is that what strongly typed means?
Yeah, like for example, and there are like some really fun JavaScript examples of this where like something that you think is a number can be handled as a string. There's like classic examples of it. But in JavaScript code that is not typed, you can just create a variable and you could set that variable to 1, which is an integer, or you could set it to quote the number 1, which is a string. And there's a lot of funky errors that can come up when your application doesn't know anything about the intent of what you want to store in that variable, the type of that data. And TypeScript makes you define that, or there are some cases where it could derive it. But like if you created a new constant in JavaScript, you would say constant URL : string. And that tells TypeScript, I always want this to be a string. And if you try to pass an object or an array into it or an integer into it, it's going to throw an error.
Yeah.
And that can actually prevent like a whole... I was a TypeScript skeptic in the beginning because it can have a learning curve. But as I became more familiar with it, I realized that the process of having to essentially tell TypeScript what your intent is exposes a whole lot of bugs before they even can happen.
I just learned why it's called TypeScript, didn't I?
Yeah, I think you did. And I want to give Brian like huge props for explaining code in a audio medium, because that is literally the hardest thing to do on the face of the earth. So you, sir, can take the rest of the day off, crack a Gansett, and thank you for that, because that was very, very clear as to why they call it TypeScript.
Cool. I do want to loop around to like the original question. So I briefly explain what TypeScript is. The package is written in TypeScript, but it's also very easy to distribute it in such a way that it could be used in a TypeScript project or just in regular traditional JavaScript. So you can do either.
Awesome.
Very cool. So in preparation for this show, I kind of went and looked at some of the documentation. Yes, Randy, I read the documentation. I know, surprising, but and was noticing that your quick start guide, the second direction is first create an instance of the client. Where would one do that? I'm assuming it's not a custom module after our conversation here today. I'm assuming it's in your JavaScript project or possibly in a template file if you're using this within Drupal. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And yeah, this definitely I've heard this same question before, and it kind of comes back to people looking at this through their Drupal glasses. And I think there's more that we can do to make the documentation clearer, but it's wherever you write your JavaScript. So if it is if you're outside of Drupal in a JavaScript framework, it's there. If it's in Drupal, it's in whatever Drupal JavaScript file you're loading as part of your library. And that statement, create an instance of the client, like what that really means is, creating an instance of the class. It's the line where you create the Drupal JSON API client instance. But that all happens, in your JavaScript, wherever that may be. And it's tough to talk about sometimes because it could be in Drupal, it could be in Next.js, it could be in Vue, it could be in your browser.
I think you already answered this, but what kind of people are going to use this? It's not something that you enable and click a couple of buttons. Is it? It's front-end developers. It's other people too. What kind of people are going to be using this?
Yeah, it's definitely a developer tool, and it's JavaScript developers. So, and that can encompass a whole bunch of different people, and it could be, very JavaScript focused developers. It could be Drupal developers who are dabbling in JavaScript, but JavaScript developers. And I also would say that it's probably a little bit more focused on the fully decoupled outside of Drupal use case than it is the inside of Drupal use case, although both are possible.
Before I ask my next question, I remember seeing an issue in Core about creating, this is hosted on NPM, right? I think you mentioned. I saw an issue a while ago about creating a Drupal namespace in Core for certain libraries. And I think right now Once is the only one that's really maintained there, maybe one other. Is this project in the Drupal namespace? If it's not, is there a plan to move it there at some point?
Yeah, I think that issue was an issue that I created, so I've teed this up perfectly.
Awesome.
But yeah, so and this also kind of goes back to some of the work that I participated in with the decoupled menus initiative. But so Drupal does have a namespace on NPM. It's the at Drupal organization, and right now there are 4 packages. Originally, there were just 2. One is Once, and another one is an accessible autocomplete that was being worked on. And I think the intent for both of those packages is that they would be used by Drupal core. And then the decoupled menus initiative also added 2 packages to work with the decoupled menus endpoint. Okay. But all that goes to say that the process there has been a little bit informal. There aren't clear standards as to what it means to be under the Drupal namespace. And personally, I think that Drupal, this project aside, Drupal should have some sort of official utilities for JavaScript developers to work with Drupal's APIs. And I think people expect to see that, under the Drupal namespace or somehow clearly delimited, clearly labeled as a Drupal project. And that is not currently the case.
So why not? Why call this Drupal API client as opposed to like Drupal JS? Like, would that be just too generic? Like, I feel like the API client piece of it kind of like makes me think harder than I have to. It seems like this is really just like a helper library for JS developers to connect to the Drupal APIs easier.
Yeah, the naming part is always tough. And I think that the name here isn't necessarily perfect. The reason that we didn't do that is, one, there are pre-existing Drupal JS libraries. It's that problem of people solving this problem over and over in slightly different ways. And then also, I didn't necessarily want to kind of aggressively claim that namespace unless we were really more of a Drupal blessed project. So in a world where this does end up under the Drupal namespace on NPM or somehow a more official Drupal package, maybe something like that would make sense. But
and by the way, that was not meant as a disparagement on your naming convention. I just, at that point in time, it clicked for me that this is really like a set of helpers for JS developers to interact with Drupal, and was wondering like if there was some reason why it was called the way it was.
Yep. Yeah, naming things is hard.
Agreed.
But so and I think hopefully we can add it to the show notes as well. But there is an issue in the ideas queue about the idea of promoting these packages under the Drupal namespace. Personally, I think it would be good for Drupal and a useful thing to do. I'm sure that's up for debate. If we were to do it, I think there also would be a good conversation around what does that mean? How does a project get promoted to the Drupal namespace on NPM? Who is responsible for it? How do security updates happen?
I also think there's some strangeness about the fact that the current ones, like once I think, for example, is maintained on GitHub, I think, which is the traditional place for JavaScript development to happen, but Drupal does have GitLab. So should it move over there at some point? I mean, there's a lot of open questions, but yeah, I'm curious to see what happens there. One final question, which is kind of related, but not exactly. Do you think API client will be added to core ever, or is adding it to the core namespace and npm the equivalent of adding it to core?
Yeah, I think of that as essentially the equivalent of adding it to core. And again, there's a lot that needs to be ironed out about what it would actually mean to promote something to the Drupal namespace. But yeah, I think it is the right distinction that this literally is not part of core, and does not have to be managed as part of core releases. But a way to say this is an official Drupal JavaScript utility, I think, is the intent.
Sorry, my developer hat is coming on, and now I'm starting to wonder about some of the more intricate details. One of the things about JavaScript, as you mentioned, is it tends to move a lot faster than Drupal core does. So I can imagine you needing to do more major releases to handle things. Like, how do you plan to handle core changes and make sure? Because like with Composer, you can create the PHP dependency and be like, hey, this is only going to work with this particular version of Drupal. But NPM and Composer, correct me if I'm wrong, don't really have a way to communicate. Like, is there a way for you to say this API client only works with version, like it's a reader of the system? Like, there's no way for it to say this only works with 10.1 and above other than documentation, right? Like, how do you plan to handle those types of issues?
Yeah, that is a good question. And there isn't a way that I'm aware of off the top of my head to, essentially have a node package that has a Composer dependency, which is like the only way that you could actually solve that problem. We do manage our releases with semantic versioning. So in a case where there was a breaking change in Drupal, there would probably have to be a breaking change in this package. But you're right, there really isn't anything right now beyond documentation that would make that clear. It's a good question.
I mean, the only way I can see it, and would probably be a huge security issue, but is a way for Drupal to report its version to the client, and then the client can be like, hey, this site is reporting version 10.3, we're not compatible with it, or there's a lot of deprecations or something, so you need to update your information. But I mean, you can authenticate that, and that probably solves most of the security issue. But reporting out specific versions of Drupal is kind of fraught with security implications.
That's a good point.
But that's probably one of the only ways to do it.
Yeah, it could be more the JSON API spec. Maybe that's the thing that is more important. Like if there's a version of Drupal that where JSON API uses a different version of the JSON API spec, and the root JSON API endpoint does have some metadata. So that could be a possible way to solve it.
Interesting.
So I did read somewhere that you have a roadmap for API client, and I know you're coming out of Pittsburgh and you have a whole bunch of new ideas and new stuff you want to implement. I'm wondering kind of what's on that roadmap and what's next for API client.
Yeah, definitely at this point in the project, we want to try to follow the needs of the community as much as we can. So we're definitely looking for feedback and use cases that we could focus on that will help the people who are actually going to use this thing. But we do have a 1.x meta issue, and a couple of things that we're interested in focusing on there is one is just around improvements with TypeScript and also schema generation. So Drupal itself, you can create, all these complex content models, and aside from what ships in core, there aren't like standard content types. But there's a lot of ways that a JavaScript package like this can derive a schema from JSON. There's the JSON API schema module. So there's a lot of opportunity for a package like this to be able to automatically determine your Drupal schema so that it can, do type checking, and also in your IDE, it can auto suggest, variable names, so that rather than having to look up what the name of your field is, you can start typing and, access the image field. So that's an area that we want to focus on. There has been interest in a GraphQL package that's similar to the JSON API client package. We've started a branch for that, scaffolded it, and have a bunch of issues for that.
Okay.
And then, beyond that, utilities that could be helpful for people, beyond the feedback that we get. So a media utility is something that we've been thinking about a little bit. So how can you easily get a URL path and alt tags and things like that from a media entity?
Image presets. I imagine image presets for like responsive images would be another one that could be huge, right?
Yep, that can be a tricky problem in decoupled sites, because sometimes you want to use the image styles defined in Drupal. Sometimes you actually want to handle that on the front end. But there are a few JSON API related modules that handle that. And a lot of those will just work out of the box, because this package just deals with the JSON API spec. So if JSON API can spit it out, we should be able to consume it. But yeah, there might be some ways to make that easier.
So it sounds like Chapter 3 is generously supporting a lot of your open source work on this. I assume that benefits them directly. You said the next module. But anyway, how does all that work with Chapter 3? How does it benefit them? What's in it for them, et cetera?
Yeah, it's certainly a mix. And Chapter 3 does sponsor some of my time to contribute. I do also work on client projects. And I also do want to thank Pantheon as well. The time when I was at Pantheon, they sponsored some of my contribution on this project also. But yeah, that's part of why I was excited to join Chapter 3, and that I think that a lot of these different projects can kind of inform each other. So being able to work on decoupled client projects, and then also be a little bit more closely involved with the Next for Drupal project, which is a popular starter kit for decoupled projects with Drupal. I'm hoping it can just continue to build up a bunch of use cases that we can solve in packages like this or in the Next for Drupal project, so that some of the baseline decoupled things can be handled and a little bit easier out of the box. And we can get on to some of the more fun JavaScript excitement. And the other thing that I'll say just about Next for Drupal in general, at DrupalCon, I got a chance to talk to a lot of people who are using Next for Drupal, but I feel like there's a little bit of a kind of a break in the feedback loop there, where I think a lot of people in the community are using that project, but there isn't a lot of experiences from people coming back to the project and hearing what's working well, what's not. So hopefully being a little bit more involved, I'm going to try to work on getting a little bit more feedback, being more active in the issue queue. But I think, again, all of that kind of funnels into just trying to make decoupled easier and more powerful for Drupal.
So this next question is going to be a little difficult to answer, I think, but I'm curious. Let's assume that I'm an experienced Drupal developer. I'm familiar with JavaScript frameworks. I may have dabbled on a headless site here and there. If I wanted to get started with the Drupal API client, what kind of spin up time can I expect? Is it extraordinarily complex? I'm going to spend a couple of weeks just learning the system. Is it kind of just get it installed and follow a couple of docs and good to go and I'm running next? Or what does that onboarding process look like?
Yeah, it should be quick. Definitely shouldn't be weeks. There is the challenge that there are a lot of different kind of entry points to this, but yeah, I would follow the docs. We have a getting started guide and a detailed JSON API tutorial in the docs. There also is a live interactive code sandbox that you can spin up that actually would allow you to use the client in the browser. That's a way that you can get up and running quickly. And even within the documentation, there are like live code examples as well. So the hope is that you can follow along and get, at least a hello world. I've got data from Drupal on the screen pretty quickly.
Okay.
And if we don't have that, we need to make the docs better.
Awesome. And I think this next question that John's about to ask is a question that we'll be asking almost every guest over the next few weeks.
What is your favorite color?
God.
Wait, no, that's
red.
That's not the right question. So obviously everybody in the community is talking about Starshot Experience Builder. And I'm wondering how that initiative is going to potentially impact API Client and maybe, widely the decoupled Drupal scene, if you will.
Yeah, it is it's a very, very interesting time for Drupal. I'm following Starshot and Experience Builder from a couple of different perspectives. It definitely does seem to be a point in time where there's the opportunity for Drupal to take on more modern JavaScript. Like with Experience Builder, there does seem to be a lot of focus on trying to use React within Experience Builder. So, this could be an opportunity to either, make it easier to use JavaScript within Drupal, or, some of the things that are being built to make Experience Builder possible might help enable decoupled use cases. One piece of that actually is as part of Experience Builder, one of the assumptions I think is that they're going to have to add a JSON storage type in core. So right now, stuff like Layout Builder, the data for Layout Builder is a serialized PHP array, which JavaScript do not like.
I don't think anybody likes it.
Yeah, that's very true. But that's a situation where I think that it could easily benefit decoupled use cases as well. And even something like the Drupal API client, like it should have utilities that allow it to work really well with that JSON data structure. Even if, there are already things built into core to do that. So that's an exciting possibility. And that just in general, as we talk about, with Experience Builder, handling things like styling and being able to do more things within the Drupal interface, trying to make sure that doesn't block existing decoupled use cases is also something that I'm interested in like following along with as well.
That was a very interesting example, because I when I asked the question, I was kind of like, they don't really have much to do with each other. But in thinking about kind of Layout Builder and Experience Builder and how it stores that data, moving that to JSON, I know that's something that, the project I'm working on, we actually built a normalizer to be able to do that, to be able to push that Layout Builder data out to JSON API. But like having that built into core would definitely be a plus for not only for those two initiatives, but also for decoupled sites. So that was a great example.
It's not even for decoupled. I mean, the thing is, once it's a native JSON field, MySQL can interact with it again, which would mean things like views can start to interact with content on Layout Builder again, right? Layout Builder is great, and people that like it love it, and it's a huge selling point for a lot of marketing teams in Drupal. I think it's fantastic. But one of the big things that it does is it breaks a lot of bedrock Drupal core principles of like expectations, like is it going to be available in views? How's translation going to work? That kind of stuff. And if we get that into JSON, I think a lot of that stuff can come back. Now, that being said, I think one of the big things about Starshot and Experience Builder that personally I'm going to have to get used to is I think there's going to be a decent amount of breaking some of those conventions in order to be able to move quickly and get the features that we need in place. And, I think purists are going to have to get used to that.
Well, that JSON thing though, right? That's going to end up having to be a core change. It's not like Starshot can just do that on its own. I mean, I guess it could, but like feels to me like it should be a core change.
Well, Core couldn't do it until 11.0. I mean, Drupal has supported JSON in MySQL and MariaDB since it was available in, what was it, like 10.4 or something, but Core can't add something like that until the minimum version supports that feature. You can't add a new feature just because it supports the newest version, because they have to support the older version. So I think 11.0 is the first version of Drupal that the minimum supported version of MariaDB and MySQL supports JSON. So now Core can start leveraging it, which is one of the, I mean, there's many reasons, but that's one of the reasons why you see a lag time between when something becomes available to Drupal core versus contrib. Because I've used the JSON field on many projects in the last couple of years. Before we close out the show, Brian, I'd like to ask you one last question. Is there anything you would like to share with our listeners, including how they could get involved if they want to help out?
Yeah. I'll just take the opportunity to, for anybody who's interested in getting involved with the Drupal API client. There's a Drupal API client channel in Drupal Slack. We have every Thursday bi-weekly async Slack meetings. That's a good place to come in and say hi. There's a lot of issues in the issue queue, but also in general, we definitely just want to hear of the people who are using this or interested in using it. What are use cases? What would you like to be able to see a package like this do? And there's just a lot of endless opportunities for us to document use cases with different frameworks and cool and exciting JavaScript things.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron. All right, Brian, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I'm Brian Perry on Drupal Slack. I am still somehow on Twitter. I'm Bri Comedy. I'll at least see you if you tag me. Online Nintendo games also. Find me there.
Awesome. Randy, how about you?
You can find me most places, including Drupal.org and GitHub and Slack at RFAY. I'm Randy Fay on Twitter and a couple other places, but pretty easy to find.
John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.